So thank you all so much for joining. Can I get someone from the Zoom world to confirm that you can hear us at the moment?
Yes, we can.
We can.
Excellent. Thank you all on Zoom. Hi, Rocky. Great to see you. Hi, Raph, who I think is with you. Hi, Brittany. Hi, Daria. Hello, Zoom world. We're really excited to have you with us here in this hybrid event format to continue our Arctic Climate Week events. So we are live from the Harvard Kennedy School here in Wexner 102 for Arctic Oceans Challenges and Opportunities. This serves as our third event in our Arctic Climate Week series. So thank you all so much for seeing some familiar faces here in person and some familiar names in Zoom. So thank you for continuing this Arctic climate journey with us. As an intro, my name is Danny Bicknell, and I'm the Interim Research Manager here at the Arctic Initiative. This event series is supposed to allow us to engage the community on the impacts of climate change in the Arctic and its global implications. Through the event series, we've been featuring some of our Arctic Initiative team members, our faculty, our fellows, our students as well. For this event here today, I'm going to be introducing Sarah Amish, who is one of the Arctic Initiative research assistants, who will then introduce our two speakers for the events, our fellows, Dr. Sarah Mackie and Nadia Filimonova. So we're really excited for this conversation today. Before we go ahead and continue, I just wanted to acknowledge that this event will be recorded. The recording will be made available to any registrants and put on our YouTube site. So for whatever reason, if you are uncomfortable with your image or name appearing in the video recording, I wanted to provide an opportunity for you all to either turn off, rename, or potentially depart the in-person event just for your own privacy. And with that, we will continue and turn it over to Sarah Amish, who is a current Master in Public Policy candidate here at the Harvard Kennedy School.
Thank you, Danny. So excited to be introducing our speakers for today. So Sarah Mackie is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Arctic Initiative. She holds a law degree from the University of Cambridge, and she most recently completed her PhD on comparative environmental law in the Arctic, with a particular focus on endangered species protection across Arctic jurisdictions. Her current research explores issues of endangered species protection law in the Arctic nations and the Arctic Ocean. She has published a number of journal articles, including the Harvard Environmental Law Review, authored a chapter in a book on environmental security in the Arctic Barents region, and has another book chapter in the works. Nadia Filimonova is a fellow with the Arctic Initiative as well, and is an affiliate fellow additionally at the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Institutes in Potsdam. She is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. In the past, she has worked in Russian and Swedish research and educational institutions, and has been the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, and is the author of several peer-reviewed publications. And her current research focuses on the urban climate change governance in the Arctic.
So we'll turn it over to Sarah and Nadia.
So, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real joy and pleasure to see you participating in this fantastic event. And I'm really excited to talk about the topic of Arctic Ocean, its challenges and opportunities. And in my brief presentation, I would like to raise two important questions. Then those will be followed out by Sarah in her presentations with the more issues to be raised. So first of all, I would like just briefly to say of the Arctic Ocean, that is actually the smallest ocean of the five major world's oceans, and it's surrounded by the coastlines of the five Arctic states, including Russia, that has the longest coastline in the region, followed by Canada, United States of America, Denmark, represented by Greenland, and Norway. So why the Arctic Ocean is important, and why should we have this discussion today and in general among academics and policymakers? Well, there are several reasons for those discussions. First of all, is that the Arctic Ocean is actually a home for many animals and marine species. And for the iconic polar bear that kind of became a symbol for the changing Arctic. According to the present research, there are around 240 species being located at present in the Arctic. But more important is that the Arctic Ocean is crucially important for the people who are living in the Arctic. And just to remind you that there are about 4 million people living in that region, and 10% of those are represented by various indigenous communities that are living across various regions of the Arctic. And therefore, Arctic Ocean is particularly important for those communities who are living at the coastline of the marginal seas of the Arctic Ocean, for preserving their traditional way of living, including hunting and shipping. As we have countries bordering the region, including Russia and the United States, we also have those geopolitical interests come into play. And there are always academic discussions about whether there will be a conflict eruption in the Arctic, or whether the Arctic should be a zone for peace and cooperation. And just to tell you that there are legal maritime disputes in the Arctic, and to say good things is that we have actually legal instruments to solve those maritime legal disputes, including the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea, that actually provides the rights for the coastal states, not only in the Arctic Ocean, to extend their maritime boundaries. A couple of years ago, there were all the headlines in the newspapers and in different conferences around the world that there will be a gold rush for the Arctic, especially in particular of the potential mineral resources that are located in the seabed of the Arctic Ocean, which is still a matter for research and investigation. But there is this well-known and well-cited report produced in 2008 by the USA Geological Survey that was claiming that around 13% of the world's unconventional oil reserves and around 30% of world's natural reserves are contained to be found in the seabed of the Arctic Ocean. There are also this potential for exploring the marine routes in the Arctic, including along the Russian coast, the northern sea route, and along the Canadian coast, the Northwest Passage. This is also a matter of legal disputes among the countries, particularly the United States, not recognizing those passages as internal waters of the respective countries. It's also the economic use of the Arctic Ocean presents some sort of challenges for the indigenous communities and that are living along the coastlines in terms, for instance, pollution from shipping, in terms of heavy fuel use. And maybe you have read the recent news from the Pope that there was presentations made by representatives of Inuits and actually calling for prohibiting of the heavy fuel use for shipping in the Arctic Ocean. But what is more important is that the Arctic Ocean is actually an area for cooperation for scientists. And here just give an example of this mosaic expedition, and mosaic stands for multidisciplinary drifting observatory for study of the Arctic climate. It was the expedition was led by the German Alfred Wegener Research Institute, and around 80 research institutes from 20 countries around the world were participating in that expedition. It lasted from September 2019 for around a year, and I really advise you to look at their website and to see the fantastic pictures and information that is published there. And so having this scientific cooperation is critically important as the the climate change in the Arctic is happening 3 times as fast as in the rest of the world. And this changes in the Arctic brings me to another important question that I would like to raise in my presentation, is why the Arctic Ocean is sort of important for us, people living in this Cambridge area, and why should we be more involved with the Arctic Initiative activities, in particular at Harvard Kennedy School. And one question, or one of the reasons deal, of course, with the climate change in the Arctic, and there was study published in 2019 by scholars from the atmospheric and environmental research that tries to sort of identify the correlation between the changing climatic conditions in the Arctic and the kind of the happening of the severe snowstorms across the US. And on the map, hope you can see the cities that the scientists were focusing on, having around 60,000 points for a daily surveying. And in their research, they conclude they didn't explain the causal mechanisms that is still a subject of research, but they figure out the correlation that basically it was more likely that severe storms were happening, particularly in the northeast of the US, when the Arctic was abnormally warm. And in connection to the harsh climatic conditions, we have another kind of connection of the Cambridge and Boston area to the Arctic and the Arctic Ocean. In January 2018, the Washington Post just published an article that a French carrier shipped gas that was actually extracted from the Russian gas field located on Yamal, the famous LNG Yamal project that was run by the Russian company Novatek in cooperation with the French company Total and two companies from China, CNPT and Royal Silk Fund. And with that, I give the floor and the screen to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Nadia. That was a really brilliant introduction to some of the things that we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. So a lot of what Nadia's been talking about, I'm going to hopefully go through in just a little bit more detail. So hopefully by this point in Arctic Climate Week, you've worked out where the Arctic Ocean is. If not, Nadia did an excellent introduction. Obviously, the Arctic Ocean is at the far north of the planet. The Arctic itself is located, there's a little bit of a dispute about exactly how the Arctic's defined, but we have the Arctic Circle, which lies at 66 degrees north. There's also the 10-degree isotherm, which is the line at which the average temperature in July doesn't go above 10 degrees Celsius, which is more or less around the 66 degrees north line, but it's not quite. And then the final sort of definition of the Arctic is that is the tree line. So trees don't grow in the sort of the very cold tundra of the Arctic, but actually in the European Arctic, the geography is quite different, and they do still have trees. So some biologists in particular use the tree line as a line that describes the Arctic. The Arctic Ocean is the ocean in the middle of that, and as Nadia said, it's the smallest of the world's oceans. It's almost entirely, or at least it traditionally was almost entirely, a frozen ocean surrounded by land. This is in opposition to the Antarctic, which is land surrounded by water. And that's actually really quite important, partly because it changes the way in which the Arctic works geopolitically. And in particular, the main big difference is that parts of the Arctic the land in the Arctic is owned by 8 Arctic nations, 5 of which are the coastal states. So that's Alaska, the United States, Canada, Greenland, which is owned by Denmark, Norway, and Russia. There's also Iceland, Sweden, and Finland. It's quite controversial that Iceland is excluded as an Arctic coastal state, and they would very much like to be included. But in actual fact, their territorial waters doesn't actually touch the Arctic Ocean. So in the Antarctic, which is different to the Arctic, the territorial claims have actually been suspended in the interests of peace and scientific endeavour. So while there are nations that that claim or have in the past claimed territory in the Arctic, those have been suspended under a treaty. So you can see that it's quite different, the Arctic to the Antarctic. And I think a lot of people get them muddled up, but it's quite useful to kind of think about the sort of opposites that really change how they work and how they're governed. So I mentioned the territorial waters, particularly Iceland, but this is how the territorial waters of different lands work. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is the treaty which governs how the world's oceans are owned and managed. The United States is not a signatory to it, but it's so widely accepted now that there is quite a debate that the Convention on the Law of the Sea has become international law despite the fact that the US hasn't signed the treaty. And certainly large parts of the treaty they do accept, at least informally. And so what you've got is at the far right, you'll see where the lighthouse is. That's the land that belongs to each country. And then you've got a baseline, and that's defined as kind of basically the edge of the land. You can have internal waters, and there's a big dispute over where islands that fall just offshore become internal waters or external waters. But that baseline is defined. Beyond that, a country then has 12 nautical miles of sea from its baseline. That is its territorial waters. They have full rights over those territorial waters, full sovereignty, full fishing rights, and full rights to the mineral resources that are found under the seabed. For the first 200 nautical miles, that includes from the baseline, is the exclusive economic zone. And this is a zone where the country has exclusive rights to fishing and exclusive rights to minerals, but has less of a sovereign right over that zone. Where a country can prove that it has an extended continental shelf that runs from its baseline, it can then make a claim to have this extended continental shelf, where they then obtain the rights to the minerals beneath the seabed, although not the fishing rights. And this has been quite controversial in the Arctic, and I'll get onto that in just a second. Beyond that is the high seas, and the high seas belong to no nation and are governed by the treaty. So these are the territorial waters of the Arctic. I don't think that one in the US is correct at all. But there is a dispute between Canada and the US as to who owns, as to who exactly where the delineation is, but I'm pretty sure it's not that. I'm pretty certain the US is not approve of that. So you can see, or you can actually see here where Iceland in the green, its territorial waters don't come up as far as the, no, Canada would not have them out, but it was by far the easiest to see of the ones that I could find. And it gives you an idea, at least, of how territorial waters work. And most importantly, it points out that section in the middle, which is the Central Arctic Ocean, which is the high seas and is owned by nobody. However, the countries, this one I think is a little bit fairer. A number of the Arctic countries are claiming a continental shelf which extends out beyond their coastline. If they were granted this, there'd be an extension of that country's rights to their mineral resources under the seabed. Now, obviously, as Nadia pointed out, this is really important, or at least these countries think it's going to be really important because they're hoping that the melting sea ice will give them access to lucrative oil, gas, and mineral resources that are believed to be beneath the Arctic Ocean. The claims that are currently in place are from Canada, Russia, Denmark, and Norway, and they can make those claims under the Convention on the Law of the Sea. The United States almost certainly also would make a territorial claim if they were signatories to the treaty, but they're not, so they can't at the moment anyway.
So the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf is the UN body that will make the decision about exactly where the continental shelves lie and who owns, if anyone, or who has claim, if anyone, to those parts of the Central Arctic Ocean. Previously, no one has bothered about this because although there was believed to be oil and gas, believed to be oil and gas in the seabed. The seabed was permanently covered by sea ice, and so there was no way anybody was going to be able to access it. But as the Arctic Ocean melts, the claims are becoming increasingly important, as they're going to decide who controls parts of the Arctic Ocean that have previously been all but inaccessible. At the moment, none of those claims have been sorted, and it's not really clear if or when they will be. And as I said, there's also a dispute between the US and Canada as to their exact delineation of the waters between them as well. So having determined who owns and controls the Arctic Ocean, at least to some extent, we're going to think about what impact climate change is having on the Arctic. The main thing is that the Arctic is melting. You probably heard multiple times this week during Arctic Climate Week about the fact that the Arctic is warming 3 times as fast as the rest of the planet. I don't think we can sort of say that any stronger than it really is. 3 times as fast as the rest of the planet. And given how fast the rest of the planet is warming, it's absolutely insane how quickly the Arctic is warming. The area of the Arctic Ocean which is frozen has always changed. In the winter, most of the sea is frozen, with the maximum extent of Arctic sea ice reached in early March. And then as the temperatures warm in the spring and the summer, some of that ice melts, reaching its minimum extent towards the end of September. And then it begins to freeze again at the start of October. Where the ice doesn't melt in the summer, it builds up each year, growing thicker and also less salty. This multi-year ice is much stronger than the ice which freezes and melts each year, and is much less prone to melting in the summer. You can therefore see that once the multi-year ice starts to melt, its rate of melting speeds up. As come the summer, the newly frozen ice melts much more quickly than it would have done when it was multi-year ice. So as the Arctic warms, we're seeing less and less ice, both at the winter maximum and at the summer minimum. And I want to show you a clip, if this works, which demonstrates exactly sort of how this has worked. So this is going to basically show you the extent of Arctic sea ice since 1984. And it shows you the freezing and the melting of the sea ice. The bright blue is newly frozen ice, so that's less than, it's sort of 1 to 2 years old. The white is the older multi-year ice, and the open water is the dark grey, with the lighter grey being land. So hopefully this will show you what's been happening since 1984. So I think, so that video was made by Esri, who are actually one of our collaborators on some of the projects that we do. And it's a little bit shocking, I think, when you start to see just how quickly that multi-year ice is disappearing. And I think what you could really see is that once that white multi-year ice began to disappear, it disappeared really, really quickly. So while we're not saying yet that the Arctic is going to be ice-free in the winter, what we're predicting is that the Arctic Ocean will be ice-free in the summer, almost certainly within our lifetimes. There's a debate about whether it's going to be 20 years or 30 years, but I think certainly for most of us, I think we will see the Arctic Ocean being all but ice-free in the summer, which will really dramatically change both the Arctic and the rest of the planet. The melting sea ice in itself is terrible for the warming of the planet, because the white ice of the Arctic reflects the sun's rays back into space, while the dark open water absorbs heat, thereby intensifying climate change. So you get, as well as this removal of the multi-year ice, you get this feedback loop whereby the more open water there is, the more heat that gets absorbed, and therefore the more warming that there is. And as Nadia said, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It then affects the rest of the planet, because that warming then continues to warm the rest of the planet as well. And we remove some of the ability of the planet to keep itself warm. So we've discussed, and we've been discussing over this past week, some of the problems with climate change and climate change in the Arctic in particular. But for some, it's going to open up some opportunities, and there are companies and there are countries that are hoping that there are going to be new economic opportunities being brought about by this melting. And so, what we're going to do now is just have to think about what those opportunities are and the, in particular, environmental challenges that are brought about by those opportunities. So as we've already said, the Arctic coastal states are hoping to be able to find oil and gas and mineral resources beneath the seabed that they were previously going to be unable to access. The other thing that a lot of companies and countries are hoping will happen is the ability to access the Arctic Ocean for shipping. You may have heard of the Northern Sea Route or the Northwest Passage. These are two routes from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. The Northern Sea Route is there marked in red, and that primarily goes through Russian and European waters. And the Northwest Passage goes through US and Canadian waters. Now, explorers have been searching for these routes for centuries, but until the last few years, it was impossible to take a ship across the Arctic because of the sea ice. Now, for the very first time, it's possible for ships to get through during the summer. In 2017, the first ship navigated the Northern Sea Route without the use of an icebreaker. By 2019, there were 2,694 voyages. And it seems that despite the fact that trade routes across the rest of the world have been affected by the pandemic, the number of ships going through the Northern Sea Route actually hasn't dropped at all. They mostly bring liquefied natural gas from Russia into Europe. But the opening of these sea routes can have a dramatic impact on the rest of the world, particularly in terms of international trade. Taking goods by sea in this way would cut both the distance travelled by ships and the time it would take to transport goods from one side of the planet to the other. Today, a ship travelling from Japan to Rotterdam would usually go by the Suez Canal, travelling a distance of 11,500 nautical miles and taking approximately 30 days. The same ship travelling via the Northern Sea Route would only travel 6,900 nautical miles and would take a mere 18 days. So you can see that using this route would dramatically cut the cost and the time in a way that would give traders who could use this a significant competitive advantage. There could be some positives to come out of this. There are economic interests in making trade easier, quicker, and cheaper. And the shipping industry contributes more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere than the aviation industry. So cutting distance and time at sea would reduce the carbon output of the industry. However, it's not all good news. The climate implications of the Arctic sea ice melting to such an extent as to enable trade in this way will be appalling for the planet. and relying on further global warming to enable a cut in maritime shipping industry carbon emissions pretty much amounts to shutting the stable door after the horse is bolted. By that point, the difference will be pretty much irrelevant. Ships also bring a significant amount of pollution with them, and the fuel used by ships emits black carbon, which, if it turns nearby ice black when it lands on it, increases the heat absorption of that ice, thereby increasing the likelihood of further melting. The more ships that use these routes, the more likely there is to be an accident. Search and rescue in the Arctic remains extremely difficult, as despite the warming conditions, they're still extremely challenging. There's also the risk of a fuel spill, which could be absolutely devastating to the local environment and would be remarkably difficult to clean up in the Arctic. And the Exxon Valdez accident that happened off Alaska is still considered one of the worst human environmental incidents that occurred due to the environmental problems that it brought about. And that was a lot further south than some of these ships would be if they spill oil on the Northern Sea Route or in the Northwest Passage. It's not just trade ships which are set to plough the Arctic waters. Cruise ships have also got their eye on the opening Arctic. There's a lot of interest in the Arctic from tourists, as has been seen by the explosion of the tourist industry in Iceland, and I imagine most of you have been part of that. Many people are keen to see the Arctic while it's still considered to be pristine, and cruise companies have already begun to take advantage of this. But just as with shipping, there are pros and there are cons. There are economic opportunities for the cruise companies, and also to some extent for the local people in the ports where the cruise liners stop. However, like with the shipping industry, cruise ships emit pollution, they risk spilling fuel, they risk losing or indeed throwing plastic overboard, and they generally risk contributing to the environmental decline of the Arctic. It would also be extremely difficult to rescue the passengers on a cruise liner, probably even more so than shipping, where you've got at least a professional crew who, to some extent, should know what they're doing. In addition, and I think this is probably a little bit different a little bit different to shipping, is there are quite significant cultural concerns around cruise ships of tourists arriving in indigenous villages, where people are acting as spectators of the people and then just disappearing. I was in East Greenland doing some field work now. This particular ship is from Nuuk in West Greenland, but I was hoping to find a picture of the one that we saw in East Greenland. It's a very tiny little village, and suddenly one morning this cruise ship showed up, and all these people just like arrived in the village, all wearing identical coats because they borrowed them from the cruise liner, and they wandered around the village. They spent absolutely nothing because they've already paid an absolute fortune to have full board and lodging on the boat. They wandered around, they stared at the people who were going about their daily lives, and then they all got back on the ship for lunch, came back, had another look, and then disappeared in the afternoon. And while for some people there will be economic opportunities in providing activities for those tourists, for a lot of other people, they're not there, like they're just living their lives, they're not there to be gawped at, and there is a significant risk that what cruise ships are selling is the opportunity to go gawp at indigenous villages, and that is very, very concerning, both for the villages and for the other people who care about the Arctic. As well as cruise liners and shipping, one of the big industries in the Arctic is fishing. At the moment, the Central Arctic Ocean, that bit that I showed you that is owned by nobody, is still frozen all year round. But if it does melt, then as well as the oil and gas under the seabed, there's going to be another valuable resource that's going to become available, namely fish. The fishing industry is already a major industry in the Arctic with billions and billions of dollars. But as the seas warm and the ice melts, fish stocks are actually moving further north in search of colder waters. If the Central Arctic Ocean melts, then it's likely to result in extremely lucrative fisheries, particularly if the more southerly fisheries begin to warm, and so will be less lucrative than they have been in the past. However, we don't really know very much about the ecosystem of the Central Arctic Ocean because it's been frozen and it's been very difficult to explore it. and we really don't know what it's going to be like if and when it melts. So in order to protect it, an agreement has been reached. It was reached in 2018 between the relevant countries, primarily the Arctic coastal states, and then others with interest in the Arctic, such as China and the European Union. And they've agreed that they will ban commercial fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean, at least for a period of time that will enable scientific investigation to take place, so that we know how best the Central Arctic Ocean can be managed, and how, in particular, fishing can be managed to make sure that we don't absolutely destroy those fisheries. The ban came into force this year on the 25th of June, and it will initially last for 16 years. And then is renewable in 5-year increments after that. 16 years isn't actually very long. That will disappear, I think, probably more quickly than people realise. So that's just an agreement that's definitely worth keeping an eye on, and to see what happens over the next few years, and the plans that are likely to be made for the Central Arctic Ocean. I've mentioned plastics a couple of times, and plastics are one of the other big challenges in the Arctic Ocean. The Arctic's really no longer the pristine environment that you might have imagined, untouched by plastic pollution and marine debris. Instead, while there is less plastic in the Arctic than there is in other oceans, the issue of plastic pollution in the Arctic is absolutely huge. And compared to the amount of people and the amount of use that the ocean gets, there is significantly more plastic than compared to the other oceans. Plastic enters into the Arctic from a variety of different sources. We've got rivers that flow into the Arctic Ocean, particularly in Russia, where the Arctic is much more. There are far more people that live there, and there's much bigger cities, but also from the other countries as well. From fishing boats, fisheries are probably one of the biggest polluters in the Arctic. They throw, or I guess lose, depending on how you see it, nets and buoys and lines and all sorts of plastic overboard. Shipping, as we've already discussed, for municipal waste management from communities that are located on the shores. And plastic also flows north from the Pacific Ocean, where the Arctic actually acts as a sink. So plastics get caught in the gyre that's found in the Arctic, and they build up with no means of escape. So when water enters the Pacific Ocean, plastic enters the Pacific Ocean, a lot of it actually ends up in the end in the Arctic. And you may have heard of the garbage patches around the world. The one in the Arctic isn't actually considered one of the official ones yet, but it's getting to the point where it probably will be counted amongst the others, because it is so big. You've also got plastics coming in as microplastics. They come in on the wind. Microplastics are where plastics break. So plastic never disappears. Your large bits of plastic get broken down to be smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually, when they're really tiny, they're called microplastics. A lot of them are not even visible to the naked eye. They also come from a lot of our clothes these days are made out of plastic, and when you wash those clothes, the tiny plastic fibers that come out of that get washed away in the water, and those also end up in the ocean, and a lot of those then end up in the Arctic. And there's large amounts of microplastic and indeed macroplastic actually frozen into the sea ice, and as the sea ice melts, that plastic is going to be released. So at the moment, it's held in the Arctic often because it is just frozen into the ice and doesn't really do anything. But as that melts, that's just going to end up in the water. Plastics are a problem in the Arctic because of their huge environmental impact. One of the ways in which they cause harm is they entangle species. You may have seen photographs of seals and whales and walruses tangled up in nets and lines. And once they're tangled up, usually they either choke to death or they starve to death because they lose the ability to move. There is also a large amount of ingestion of plastics. Plastics look like tasty treats to lots of birds and to sea mammals, and so they eat them. We're now getting to the point where for some species, not all, but for some species, barely any one of those birds so scientists cut stomachs open to see of dead birds to see what's inside them, and nearly every single one of some species now has some sort of plastic in their stomach. Other species not so much. The northern fulmar seems to be a particularly bad eater of plastic. It depends really whether they feed from the top of the water or from below the water. If they feed from the top, it floats on the top, and therefore they tend to ingest more of it. So we're seeing more and more plastic being ingested. Sometimes that poisons the species. Sometimes they just fill their stomach, so they starve to death because they think they're full, and so they don't eat as much as they ought to. And so as I say, sometimes it just poisons them. The sort of chemicals that you find on plastics can be really quite dangerous. Quite dangerous to species. And this then has an impact on food security for humans as well. And we talked a little bit about Indigenous people within the Arctic. A lot of the Indigenous communities rely on subsistence hunting and fishing for survival. And if the species which they rely on become poisoned by plastic and by the chemicals that are brought in on plastics, then they themselves can end up being poisoned as well. And there's an element by which humans are more at risk because of the bioaccumulation of pollution. So one species takes in a little bit, that species then gets eaten by a bigger species, so they end up consuming more and more and more as you go up the food web. The other reason that plastics are bad for the Arctic is that they import foreign species. The Arctic being so cold is actually an environment where a lot of predators have been unable to survive. And so there is a very specific ecosystem. As it warms, it's actually becoming more and more apparent that species which used to not be able to survive at all can now survive. So you end up with invasive species coming in and actually being able to survive. And some of those come in by, they call it rafting. So they literally raft on the plastic as it floats up from other places. So there's a large number of reasons why plastics are really bad for the Arctic. It's also because it's so remote and because it's so difficult to access, it's really difficult to clean up. There are projects in various parts of the Arctic. One that I've recently been studying is in the Pribilof Islands, which they basically lie between the Pacific Ocean and the Arctic Ocean. And they've been referred to as the Northern Galapagos. They are home to 600 people, but thousands and thousands of seals and whales and walrus and dolphins and sea lions and millions of birds. But their location of the islands in the Bering Sea means that they are basically a hub for plastics that are floating past. And so vast amounts of plastic pollution that the local people have not produced ends up on those islands. Since 2003, the local people have collected 300,000 pounds of plastic pollution from their beaches, 80% of which is of that waste is from fishing gear. And one of the projects that the Arctic Initiative has been working on is plastics in the Arctic Ocean, and together with the previous postdoc, who's also called Sarah, she and I have done a piece of work on trying to quantify some of the amounts of plastic that's coming into the Arctic, where it's coming from, but then using that data to look at predicting how much plastic there is likely to be in the future if we don't do anything about it. And then we've made a number of sort of proposals, many of which also appear in the Regional Arctic Action Plan that I'll talk about in a second, which hadn't been published when we did our work. But that, looking then at putting numbers on those, on what we could do within the Arctic to try and reduce some of the plastics that exist there. So what's being done to protect the Arctic Ocean? There's actually quite a lot being done. The Arctic is becoming increasingly of interest to nations, to people, and to international bodies. And just really briefly, because I want to make sure we've got some time for questions, I just want to just quickly outline so 3 things that are happening in particular. So the Polar Code has been produced by the International Maritime Organization, and that is a mandatory code that basically tells countries what they have to do to enable ships to be allowed to operate in the Arctic. Ships will need to apply for a polar ship certificate, and that's going to classify the vessel as suitable for operation in polar waters or not. And that the Polar Code looks at a whole range of issues, from the design of ships, the construction, the equipment they have to carry, how they operate, what training is needed, what search and rescue arrangements they need, and also the environmental protection matters that are relevant to ships that are operating in the Arctic. Secondly, we've got the heavy fuel oil ban. We talked a little bit about the risk of a fuel spill in the Arctic. In June, the International Maritime Organization introduced a ban on heavy fuel oil in the Arctic because it has such high levels of carbon emission, and the environmental cost of a spill would be so huge. The ban will force ships to use alternative types of fuel. Unfortunately, the ban doesn't come into effect until 2024, and because there's actually a number of loopholes in it, it will be phased in between 2024 and 2029. So we're actually allowing for quite a lot of pollution to take place in the Arctic before we even begin to introduce that ban. And I think a lot of environmentalists in particular have been quite disappointed by how weak that ban has ended up becoming. Finally, the Regional Action Plan on Marine Litter. The Icelandic chairmanship of the Arctic Council made plastic pollution a key focus of their time as chairperson of the Arctic Council. One of the outcomes was this regional action plan on marine litter. And the aim of the plan is to support Arctic states in their efforts to reduce marine litter, in particular plastics. And as with all things in the Arctic Council, it's consensus-based, so it's not a ban, but it is a plan for how states can work together and work individually to try and reduce plastics. So a couple of the sort of recommendations that it makes is about where landfills should be sited, about promoting the marking of fishing gear. This is important because it enables the fishing gear that's then found overseas or found in the water to be identified as to who actually put it there. And there's then the hope that will shame companies into doing something about it. Another recommendation is for the provision of facilities to collect and sort and dispose and recycle of plastics at ports across the Arctic. That's particularly important given the increase of shipping across the Arctic. If you make it easy for these ships to dispose of their plastic, hopefully they'll do so responsibly rather than get something in the water. And then finally, what can you do? So there are some things that you can do. I mean, some of these issues are huge. Some of these issues are only really going to be dealt with at national and international, and probably actually at the level of individual companies. But there are things that you can do. So first of all, you can reduce your personal plastic consumption and demand that companies reduce the amount of plastic packaging that they use and the amount of plastics that you're given. Even in the local cafes around Harvard Square, you'll see time after time you'll be given a plastic spoon instead of a metal one, even if you're sitting in and eating it. But usually if you ask for metal ones, they'll give you one. So there are little things that each one of us can do. I'm not suggesting that the world refusing to use straws is really going to make the most dramatic difference in the world, but what it does do is it puts pressure on companies to change. Money talks, and consumer spending can be a forceful incentive for companies to change their behavior. I think one thing that really shocked me when I moved to the States 2 years ago compared to the United Kingdom was just how much more single-use plastic was being used here than in the UK, because increasingly pressure is being put on companies in the UK to reduce the amount of plastic that they're using. I think the pandemic has probably stopped some of that, which is a real shame. But that is something that you can do as an individual and that as consumers actually have quite a lot of power over. You can also lobby for policies which support reductions in greenhouse gas emissions at every level. So that's municipal, that's state level, that's federal level, and from companies with which you interact. Again, votes talk and money talks. And a lot of organisations and a lot of governments at all different levels are actually interested in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but they're not going to do it unless the people they think are going to vote them into power or vote them out of power actually care about it. So that's definitely one thing you can do. And finally, you can stay interested in the Arctic. Thank you so much for taking part in Arctic Climate Week. We've been absolutely delighted at how many Kennedy School students and those from outside the Kennedy School have taken part. While most of you probably aren't going to end up working in or with the Arctic in the long term, you can take your knowledge about the Arctic and how the Arctic interacts with the world into whatever public service you want. Because what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So we've got a few minutes for questions. Does anybody have any
Some
questions?
virtual applause as well.
Oh, thank you very much, Steve.
And we'll alternate any Zoom questions with the in-person questions. See, we do have a hand raised by Rocky. Rocky, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the great presentation. I wanted to ask, how do you think, so one of the big news of last week is that the ocean made it into the Glasgow Agreement for COP26, which is very exciting. How do you think that can help combat some of these challenges that you highlighted in the Arctic Ocean?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great question. And certainly the COP was very exciting. And the fact that oceans were mentioned for the first time is really exciting. I think I think that one of the main things is that the more attention that comes on these issues, the more likely it is that people are going to do something. I said at the end of that money talks and that votes talk, and actually that's true at all sorts of levels. If the international community is talking about oceans and is bothered about oceans, and if the people that vote them into power and that keep them in power are talking about oceans and are bothered about oceans, then oceans will become and continue to be an important part of the solution. So I think just the attention on oceans is important, and hopefully that attention will occur in the more southern oceans and in the Arctic. And that's what we can really hope for. But the fact that it was mentioned, the fact that it was included, the fact that it was important enough to include, I think is really positive. The other thing that you've got with the with oceans that you don't have with other places is you've already got agreements on an international level. A lot of oceans are already managed on an international level through the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So you're not starting from scratch when you're trying to manage oceans and when you're trying to manage greenhouse gas emissions across oceans. So hopefully that will be a sort of an easy win for going forward out of Glasgow.
Just to add, I'm really excited that the Arctic topic is entering all the possible international venues. So it's not only talking about the Arctic in terms of climate change, but also in connection that people are living in the Arctic and their voices are raised and their concerns are raised, that we are moving away from this state-centered perspective of geopolitics, of energy resources, of shipping, and talking more about how to improve living conditions in the Arctic. For instance, we started Grace talk about how to reduce plastic in the Arctic and those impacts that pollution has on the indigenous communities and residents who live in those territories.
Yeah, we were really pleased to see how the a lot of the indigenous communities were able to sort of have their say at the COP in Glasgow, and we hope that that continues. I know that the Arctic Council is a good example for how indigenous peoples can be involved at an intergovernmental level as they're permanent participants. So hopefully that's a model that can be used as well. Thank you. That's a good question. Is anybody else in the room? Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation. I have a question about, so over the past 5 years, I've been hearing quite a bit about melting ice, that opening up economic opportunities, and there being a potential geopolitical scramble to secure land and resources, also probably from a security perspective. But what's your perspective about the economic and technical feasibility of actually accessing some of these resources, whether they're oil and gas or mineral resources? I don't know what the potential is, but given the remoteness and the harsh conditions, is there an actual economic case for that? Or is it more motivated by, I don't know, national security or just securing those resources, whether or not you choose to access them, utilize them or not?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think probably there'd be different answers depending on who you asked. I think the way in which fossil fuels are going and the use of fossil fuels are going, the likelihood is by the time that these resources, if they even are there, become accessible, it will be so expensive to get them, and the cost of the value of them will hopefully be so little that it won't be worth it. I think a lot of the sort of scramble is maybe not taking into account the vast amount of renewable energies that are coming on board, and how quickly actually we are managing to change the way in which we use energy resources on the planet. I think if we don't do that, then the value of oil and gas will go through the roof as they become less and less accessible, less and less available, in the rest of the world. So I think there's a bit of a gamble there as to whether or not by the time the Arctic Ocean melts and these become accessible, they're never going to be very accessible. It's always going to be cold. It's always going to be remote. It's always going to be difficult. So I think hopefully by the time they are in any way accessible, actually they won't be needed. And therefore the value of them will actually be really quite low. Whether or not that's what countries are thinking and what companies are thinking, but we've seen that actually in Alaska last year, when there was all the hope of drilling in the Arctic, in Arctic National Wildlife. The Trump administration thought they were going to be able to sell all these licenses to explore, and almost nobody even bothered to put in a bid for them. It was really quite embarrassing for the Trump administration, just how nobody was interested.
So countries and companies are mostly thinking about oil and gas, not other mineral resources.
I know that. I'm not
No, there's a lot of interest in other mineral resources as well, but that would be necessarily in the ocean context. But
It's on the land.
Yeah, it's land.
Yes, yeah. I think I have diamonds, deep sea.
Yeah. But one of the things to also look at is the investment community, and there's been a huge move in the international investment community to express a position that they're not going to commit to investments in the Arctic, which is quite controversial in a lot of the Arctic context. It's sort of save one region for the sake of the others, but ultimately there's some sort of extreme resource extraction taking place in other parts of the world. So a lot of northerners will ask for a more balanced approach where there's opportunities for economic development that can transition to a more diverse economy. But at the end of the day, those resources, and even for renewables, right? Like a lot of the minerals you need for renewables actually are quite abundant in the Arctic, and so you can't sort of that transition economy.
Just to follow up on the Jen's comments, it's like just a few weeks ago, the European Union communique was released, and that provoked huge discussions because it was kind of advising on the ban of all energy activities in the Arctic. That put in a question of like those communities and those places that sort of rely on oil and gas or all extraction. What is going to do is we one day just stop everything. How we will support those people who are living there. But on another side is like talking in general about sort of interest in shipping or energy resources extraction in the Arctic. It's very environmentally risky. And when you go there, you have to take this risk. If there will be an oil leak in the Arctic, it will take several decades to remove everything. And we have already all these accidents and examples, for instance, in the Mexican Gulf. And what we're talking about, the area that is cold, that is dark, that is covered with ice. There are several projects in Russia, for instance, on Continental Shelf in Territorial Sea. It's called Territorial or gas field. Also, there are some projects in Norway, Snøhvit. There are also some kind of interest from the Russian companies to develop some fields in the Kara Sea. But again, you just need investment, and because of the Ukrainian crisis, then Russia was under sanctions, and then sort of stopped international cooperation in the energy sector, which is sort of crucial cannot do economic activities in the Arctic without international cooperation needing financial means and technology. And on the shipping route, especially with the Northern Sea route development, it's also very controversial. There are tons of research on the viability because there are all these discussions. Its route will be the outpace the Suez Canal, so there will be all this international shipping. And Russian president a couple of years ago is actually established a goal by 2024 around that there should be 80 million tons should be shipped along the Northern Sea route, and it's a huge amount like cargo, if you can imagine. And for now, Russia is not succeeding in it. And basically, if you look at the ships that go along the Northern Sea route, it's mainly for domestic purposes, as Sarah was mentioning, shipping liquefied gas from Malta that I mentioned, and also for shipping goods to the remote, for instance, places in the Arctic that sort of rely on internal shipping. So it's also the question whether there will be still an interest in the Northern Sea route as in international, because there are weather challenges, it's also shallow waters, and also, like according to the Russian legislation, ships should ask for permission and also pay for the icebreaker assistance, whether it will be economically viable, then probably spending 2 more extra days and going through the Suez Canal. It's also like when it's international trade, you have to deliver goods fast, and with the Arctic conditions, it's very unpredictable.
Well, that does bring us to time. We are slightly over, and I know that a few of you do have to go to class here at HKS. Raph, it looks like Sarah also just responded to your message in the chat.
Yeah, I've
which is wonderful.
responded to the Zoom questions in writing, so just because I didn't want them to be ignored.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone in person and on Zoom. Thank you again, Sarah and Nadia.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Tomorrow night, to continue Arctic Climate Week at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, we have Arctic Film Night, where we'll show Chasing Ice, curated by Sarah and Nadia. And next week on Monday, November 22nd, we have visiting scholar Doug Housey, conversation with Nadia on Arctic environmental security at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. So thank you all so much for coming, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much.